Hello everyone, welcome to Constantine Quarantine News Live, the 31st of March 2020. Let's get stuck into it, shall we? The first thing we're leading with is a disturbing article here in the Sydney Morning Herald, which is that 6 months in jail or an $11,000 fine for leaving home without a reasonable excuse. We've gone from the government more or less saying to people, go for your lives, self-regulate, be responsible, to now what I'm arguing is actually overly draconian. We're starting to see government do some extreme overreach. I know it's keeping the curve flat, and I know it's keeping people at home, but the idea of actually detaining people without trial is becoming, let's just say, slightly disturbing here. And we're seeing evidence of this also. Crazy. The Telegraph is showing us that Peak District's Blue Lagoon is being dyed black by police to deter visitors on coronavirus lockdown. Again, we're actually now starting to see governments really overstep the mark in my mind. There's a lot of evidence coming through. And what might be regarded as a somewhat witty video here, showing people being beaten all over India, people being beaten with rods for basically going about their business in seemingly maintaining social distancing, but nevertheless having the shit beaten out of them by sticks. And to be honest, it's actually it's kind of amusing, but equally just a sign of government maybe taking things a little bit too far. Speaking of government taking things potentially a little bit too far, we've got our first interviewee, the Executive Director of the IPA, John Roscombe. And joining us here on Constantine Quarantine is John Roscombe, the Executive Director of the IPA. Welcome, John.
Hi, Con. Great to be with you.
Now, John, tell us a little bit about the IPA for those of us that don't know it.
We're a free market think tank, Con, 76 years old, 6,000 members committed to freedom, committed to maintaining the Australian way of life, committed to economic growth and prosperity, which we'll talk about, because economics is people's lives, it's people's livelihoods, it's their families. And for me, over the last few weeks, this discussion that Australians have to choose between their health and economics is wrong. Economics is our society, is our community. So we have a big program on freedom of speech, on legal rights, on education, on the foundations of Western civilization. And we've done a lot and said a lot about the current crisis that we're in and the challenges we're going to be facing for decades to come as a result of what's happening right now.
Yeah, so the ramifications are huge. Let's start with this idea that, one of the things that's really frustrated and surprised me, the amount of people that are saying in real life and online, I'm not seeing too many people in real life at the moment, that are saying, oh, well, why can't the government tell us what to do? Oh, Scott Morrison should lock us all up and should lock people away. I would have thought that these people of supposed independence thought to be able to, self-isolate themselves. Why do we need the government to tell us what to do? Or why do they need it?
Well, I think that's right. And I'd go back on even one step further. I'd ask the question, why to stop a virus do 25 million Australians have to be basically put under house arrest? We have police guarding school playgrounds and children's playgrounds. We have drones in the sky watching that you don't go for a walk on the beach. I think what we've seen is a combination of things that relate to politicians panicking and not engaging in careful, cautious, prudent thought. We have a public that I think is divided in half between those who are part of the productive economy and those who understand what the economy is, which is our lives, and those who are urging us to be locked down, Australia to be shut up. They're not the people who are going to be losing their jobs. We have a social media phenomena that reacts to basically disaster statistics. We have a series of phenomenon taking place at the same time, which has led to this convergence of, in many aspects, bad public policy with consequences for decades to come. But to come to your point about why do we want to be told what to do? Because we're used to being told what to do. We are used to being told, don't say something offensive because that could upset someone and you could go to jail. We are used to be told, put a bike helmet on. We are used to being told, don't have so much sugar, don't have so much salt. We are used to be told. And I think this is a demonstration of what I call the infantilization of the community at every different aspect.
And why is that the case? I mean, Australia, I would have thought, we have this kind of vision or this archetype Australian, which is, reckless and no one tells us what to do, mate. And, the government can go and get stuffed. And yet equally, the moment something happens, we all turn to the government and say, the government's got to do something about it. Has this been trained into us, or is this something innately part of Australian culture, do you think?
Well, I think that's also part of human nature. And the idea that Australia is a freewheeling, libertarian, happy-go-lucky culture, I think might have been true maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mentioned bike helmets as an easy example. I was in the States talking to a green left Democrat from Oregon. You couldn't get anyone more left-wing. You couldn't get anyone more Bernie Sanders. And talking to her about Australia, she was looking forward to coming here for a visit. That was back in the day. That's not happening now. And we were talking about her cycling. I said, well, you'll need a helmet. And she said, you're joking. And she said, don't I get to choose whether I wear a helmet or not? Don't I take responsibility for my own actions? And I said, not in Australia. I think a number of other things have happened to Australia. We are a relatively small country with a relatively large government. We are a country that has grown under big business, big government, big unions. And I think we've been enculturated into looking for solutions, not from ourselves first, but from others. And I think this reaction that we've seen that you've described is another manifestation of that.
So we've gone from almost an economic accord of the 80s to a paternal social accord, if you like.
Yeah, that's right. And when we talk about getting bailed out or getting subsidies or getting support, we're not talking about the maintenance of a basic social safety net, which is the foundation of any community, quite appropriately. We're talking about something bigger than that. We're talking about having our children and grandchildren bailing us out for the decisions we are making now. 29 years of prosperity has made Australia fat. It has created an environment whereby red tape is now Australia's biggest industry. And as I wrote in the Australian Financial Review last week, it's created an environment whereby someone holding a stop-go sign on a construction site in Queensland can be paid up to $180,000 a year, twice the average salary of a teacher.
And those people are now out of jobs, and yet the parliaments of Australia, from what I understand, haven't taken any pay cuts. Is that right?
Well, they haven't. You're exactly right, Con. And we heard the other day that Matthias Cormann, as finance minister, has written to the Remuneration Tribunal of the federal government asking for pay rises to be frozen. Con, this is ridiculous. If we're talking about equality of sacrifice, the IPA's position is that to demonstrate that we are all in this together, for example, public servants earning up more than $150,000 a year can have their pay reduced by 20% for the foreseeable future.
We are all making those sacrifices.
Exactly. This distinction between those who are part of the productive economy, who are losing their jobs, who have friends who are losing their jobs, who have their colleagues out of work, and public servants who will basically be untouched by this and have enormous privileges anyway. It used to be the case that as a public servant, you were paid a bit less than the private sector, but you had a degree of job security. Now the public sector wage premium is about 20% more than the private sector, and you don't get to lose your job.
Now, speaking of pay rises, recently we saw that I think crazy timing. Crazy timing. The unions came out and said that they were in support of a 4% pay rise.
Ha!
So
That's
we
not
talk
happening.
about the public service wanting a pay freeze, but the unions want a pay rise at the time when, as a friend of mine put it, 4% of nothing is nothing. Um, um, what we're seeing, already in front of us, sadly, and even before this COVID crisis hit, was industries really suffering in Australia under horrendous awards and horrendous labour laws. In particular, hospitality, which is an area close to my heart. Um, is this COVID crisis the death knell for Australian hospitality? Do we lose our famous livability just because it is impossible to run a small business in Australia? And what might we do differently out of this COVID crisis?
And Con, after this, why would you run a small business?
Are you
Why would
telling
you?
me now?
Why would you take the risk? Why would you mortgage your home? Why would you put in 100 hours a week when the government could unilaterally, arbitrarily come and shut you down? I hope we don't lose hospitality. I hope we don't lose entertainment. I hope the live music scene will come back bigger and stronger.
The arts, hospitality,
the
music.
arts. But there's a couple of things that we've seen. One, as I mentioned, 29 years of economic prosperity inculcated us to a degree of complacency, and we thought that no amount of red tape would make any difference because the cafe can still open, that venue can still run. What we are now discovering is that all of these things have happened. The wonderful growth in Australian hospitality industry up until about a month ago was despite red tape, despite government regulation. What we need to do is go back to the very basics, and we have to understand that the red tape, the occupational health and safety requirements that are often absolutely onerous, that in many cases are absolutely unnecessary, have to go. We have to rationalise planning. We have to let people make their own decisions. And Con, you and I talked about here in Melbourne, the lockdown years ago. We have to be able to let people make their own decisions about how they entertain themselves, whether they're going to have a drink from a plastic cup or a glass. We have to embrace responsibility because that goes to our livability as a community, and we have to take back decisions from, frankly, health bureaucrats, from the public health experts that have at the moment destroyed our livability, our sociability, our sense of community, and we have to rebuild. And I think what's going to happen is there's going to be an upsurge of people wanting to take back control.
Otherwise, what we're going to find is there will be a generation of students, young people wanting work in retail and in hospitality, and retail jobs will either be robotized or hospitality jobs just simply will not exist. Because if it costs more for someone to hire someone and put them on after 5 p.m., which last I checked is the time most people go out to restaurants and bars, and that's when students want to work, and that's when there is flexibility, and that's when there is goodwill between the employees and the employers around, I want to give you a job, I want to work, let's find a way to make this happen. And if the dead hand of government's getting involved, then it's just easier for these people to go and work for the public service rather than actually trying to have a crack at making Australia a better place to live.
Oh, that's exactly right. And what the IPA has said is, from now on, any red tape, any rule, any regulation that gets in the way of employment has to go. And when we're talking about getting rid of red tape, we're not talking about getting rid of all regulation or restrictions. Absolutely not. What we're simply talking about is getting rid of rules and regulations that are more than necessary to fulfill the basic requirements that are needed for a safe and healthy community. The IPA has long advocated the abolition of penalty rates. What we're going to be seeing now is a push to get, in due course, I hope, businesses open, those that are still left, as quickly as possible. And we're going to have to realise that a lot of the luxuries we had, such as penalty rates, are no longer affordable because people are going to just want a job, and they should be given a job. They should get a job.
Good on you, John. Keep fighting the good fight. And well, hopefully this lockdown doesn't continue for too long, but we might have you on in a couple of weeks to see how we're faring, to see whether or not the government has imposed more restrictions on us, or whether or not we might be free to at least, I don't know, play tennis without being fined.
Well, Con, I completely agree. My view is we should already be lifting the restrictions, not tomorrow, not next month or in 6 months. Now, Australia has to restart start rebuilding now. And the problem that we have is these restrictions probably won't start to be lifted immediately, because no expert, no politician is going to say, we might have overreacted, we might have got this wrong. We absolutely do have a crisis, but the focus has to be on maintaining society as best we can. So I hope that when we speak next in a couple of weeks, we're all playing tennis, we're all at the playground, and we're all at the beach, but I fear it might be a little time yet.
All right, good on you, John. Thanks for joining us here on Constantine Quarantine, and good luck.
Thanks,
Stay safe.
Con.
A fantastic chat there with John. Back to it. We've got some more interesting news, well, at least analysis. This chart of the 1918 Spanish flu, this is an article in Quartz, shows why social distancing works. And it's a fantastic article. I recommend you read it, where it talks about the city of Philadelphia throwing a parade that killed thousands of people, welcoming veterans back from the war. And while Philadelphia were doing that, St. Louis, just across the road, basically decided to cancel their parade, and you saw the difference there between social distancing in one area versus lack of social distancing in another. A place where there is zero social distancing is in the sex industry in Melbourne. Interestingly enough, an article by the famous Andrew Rule in the Herald Sun showing how dodgy Melbourne sex workers are flouting coronavirus measures, and a really interesting piece that basically describes where brothels are still operating, but they're operating in more or less a very, a particularly underground way. A little bit grim there. Sadly, this is really starting to affect a tremendous amount of businesses. One of the key themes that we're seeing emerge over the last few days isn't just about I guess, where government's starting to become quite onerous, but as John just mentioned and we discussed earlier, Macy's and Gap to furlough most workers as coronavirus crisis keeps stores closed. In this article here in the Wall Street Journal, showing how more than 150,000 people have been infected in the US states, but seemingly out of Macy's, 125,000 people losing their jobs. So again, it's almost impossible to separate the cure or the prevention from, I guess, what we might calling a wholesale destruction of the economy, which is incredibly, incredibly worrying for everyone at the moment. One thing that's maybe a little bit more interesting is that a designer behind the viral COVID-19, redesign of COVID-19 logos. So instead of united, divided. Instead of good year, bad year. Instead of mobile, immobile. Locked in, MasterCard, a lovely use of social distancing there. NBA showing people lounging around. The Olympics logo, especially. Now that we've just heard the news that the Olympics has been postponed to July in 2021. Just an interesting bit of analysis there. Analysis and creativity actually. But again, what we're seeing now is some conflicting evidence, and again, this is something that is worth considering discussing. Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine (CEBM) has put out a really great report that talks about case fatality rates, and what it's showing is a variety of sources of information and a variety of reports that are really saying that there are a multitude of different ways in treating this, whether they be somewhat lockdown, some lockdown, almost a laissez-faire approach, and how that affects certain infection fatality rates and comorbidity fatality rates. And as we're seeing in countries such as Australia, Israel, Chile, there are very, very few people dying from this, even though there are still quite sizable numbers of infection there. There are approximately just over 4,000 in Australia and Israel, but very few deaths. So all the way up to Italy, where of course we're seeing a case fatality rate of 11.39%. However, as this really excellent piece shows, well, there are a number of reasons why. Are there selection biases? Are there certain issues in the data? And interestingly, it actually asks the question of, is COVID-19 the cause of all fatalities in Italy? Which leads us to this really, really interesting article by Sarah Newey that more or less asks the question, why is Italy's COVID mortality rate so high? And this really, really interesting quote here that says, Professor Riccardi mentions that Italy's death rate may appear higher because of how doctors record fatalities. He said, the way in which we code deaths in our country is very generous in the sense that all the people who die in hospitals with coronavirus are deemed to be dying of the coronavirus. And I'm going to repeat myself there. It's a really, really interesting point. People who are dying with corona, irrespective of what they're dying of, are being deemed to be dying of. There's a big difference of dying with versus a difference of dying of. So an example might be that if I'm hit by a car and I go into hospital and they test me and I happen to have coronavirus, even if I die of my wounds and injuries from that car crash, I am deemed and recorded to be dying of coronavirus. And therefore, as Dr. Licciardi said, on re-evaluation by the National Institute of Health, only 12% of death certificates have shown a direct causality from coronavirus, while 88% of patients who have died at least one pre-morbidity, many had two or three. Other experts have also expressed skepticism about the available data. And what this is again saying to us is that potentially, if I'm reading this right, that the fatality rate in Italy is actually being stated potentially up to 9 or 10 times higher than that has been recorded in other countries. So again, really interesting to get to the bottom of a lot of this data, and I've been doing a fair bit of that. So more than happy to kind of delve into that for the purposes of Constantine quarantine news. But at the same time, we have a letter to the UK from Italy. This is what we know about your future, and quite a touching, sad, disturbing, in some ways uplifting article here in The Guardian by Francesca Melandri, who is an acclaimed Italian novelist who has basically been talking about that. What we also would like to do is talk about what trends we're seeing from the future. And so joining us now on Constantine Quarantine is Chris Sanderson, the co-founder of the Future Laboratory. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Con. Nice to see you.
Likewise. Where are you at the moment?
I am in the UK. I'm in the United Kingdom on the North Sea coast, which is Suffolk. So I'm about 2 hours outside of London.
In a what looks like a beautiful, potentially seaside shack there.
Yeah, it's a seaside shack. It's a little
Isolated
place by the sea that is normally a place of respite and where I get away from the stresses and strains of London. But in this type of environment has proved to be an exceptional place to be at a time of lockdown, especially because actually the internet connection, the Wi-Fi is so much better here than in London.
So, Chris, your organisation works with global enterprises looking for trends that may endure, trends that they may use to invest in the future, providing them with some foresight, strategy, and observation and insights that help them, I guess, forge a path.
Yeah.
How on earth are you reacting to this? How on earth are you reacting to your clients in an environment where a thing like the future is, well, I guess you just throw it out, don't you?
Well, we're responding in all sorts of different ways, like everyone else. Part of it is about coping, and part of it is also about, I think, embracing and, dare I say, relishing the challenges and therefore the opportunities that these kind of situations throw up. On a practical perspective, as an organization, we've been set up for the radical shift to working from home. For years, we're basically a bunch of freelancers. So this presents no challenge, whereas I have friends and colleagues for whom They've been working with organizations that have a zero tolerance policy in terms of working from home. So to suddenly pivot their business from being one where everyone is expected through the door within a 15-minute time window to suddenly having to cope with all of their employees working from home, where you may not even have the hardware resources, let alone the software capability to actually manage any of that. It just proves a technical nightmare. Whereas for us, I've had 50 people working individually from home over the last 10 days with pretty much no technical problems whatever. And we were able to, everyone has got the kit they need, the software support they need, all of it. So in that respect, as an organization, we can be fast and we can be flexible and we can pivot. I've also got a team who have already released news stories, opinion pieces on the impact of COVID-19. And we've just gone back and looked at the research that was launching yesterday on 3 key new macro trends around consumer change in the 2020s. And they've done updates to look at the impact that COVID-19 is having on those key areas. But of course, as a business that's been predicting turbulence and fear, uncertainty and doubt as one of the key trends at the beginning of the 21st century for the last 20 years.
The turbulent teens,
and
as
then
you
the
call them.
turbulent teens, yeah, moving into the transformative 20s. The curveball of COVID-19 is not a surprise to us in terms of what it represents. Because for us, it's just a contextualization of so many other elements that are already happening and were already happening. And I think you've only got to look at the predictions from somebody like Nassim Taleb, who of course wrote The Black Swan, and countless other theorists and writers who have looked at the unpredictability of large-scale mass events that come very quickly, as opposed to the fourth industrial revolution, which happens slowly, the continued impact of the ICT, information communication technology revolution that we're all living through, the impact of the emancipation of women, which is still having a profound impact on our society. You know, there are so many things that are happening all at once that for us, the key issue for business is understanding that COVID-19 is a gearing issue, as unsympathetic or unempathetic as that sounds. And we are all having knee-jerk reactions to the immediacy of what is still, as it stands, a very low death rate when you think about how other viruses impact on the planet globally, and yet is having such a profound impact economically, politically, and socially across the world in such a brief period of time.
And Chris, this incrementalism that you're talking about, this pace of change, despite the fact that we've had the turbulent teens and we've had what we might regard as huge technological disruption in industry for the last 10, 20 years, you're arguing, and I think, you know, I agree with that thesis, that we're actually seeing very, very slow glacial incremental change. Why has change been so slow? And if we look at things like the GFC that happened, 11 years ago, there was this threat of disruption, or this threat of some type of radical change in the world. What we ended up getting was quantitative easing. Everyone fell back on a bed of money, and nothing happened. Why is this going to be any different?
Well, I think human beings respond to immediate threats in a very different way to, you know, the frog in the pan of boiling water analogy, which is that, you know, it starts off being tepid, and as you slowly turn the heat up, the comfort level of the frog copes with that incremental change in water temperature to the point of its own demise. And, you know, I think that's one of the factors that happens often with incremental change, is that, you know, it is evolutionary rather than revolutionary, whereas COVID-19 is having a revolutionary impact on the way we are thinking. And so it's becoming a catalyst for change. So we look at the travel industry, for example, where of course we're seeing a huge fallout. And I think most of us would predict a huge fallout, in that I don't think we're necessarily expecting that certain airlines will ever recover. And potentially for many of us are that infrastructure that's been created since the early 70s is likely to change and change in a profound way. And are we expecting global levels of air transport to go back to what they were before, or to potentially increase it at the level that they were predicted to increase over the 2020s? Possibly it's too early to say, but I think what's interesting is that, again, what underpins that idea of industry change or industry understanding of change is the mentality of the consumer, the customer, the person that at the end of the day is behind a lot of that travel, not all of it, but a lot of it. Are they going to change their attitude towards global travel for good as a result of the impact of COVID-19? That's what my job is to understand, and therefore to help the clients that I work with to be better placed to think about what they need to do as they address those kind of challenges moving forward.
And does that mean that scenario planning now goes from what we might call the domain of public relations, war rooms, what happens if, a bad headline hits or a bad tweet happens, to something on a much grander, larger scale?
Well, I would have thought that any professional industry, any business worth its salt had already got this kind of risk mitigation planning under their belt. I mean, any kind of scenario planning has to always involve the crazy and the completely unpredictable in order to be robust. So
the black swans, as you said.
Sure, it's the black swan, and surely from 9/11 onwards, any industry has had that level of kind of contingency planning. We certainly took it on board when we had the similar kind of terrorism attacks in London, where some of those were very, very close to our office, and we were genuinely concerned about the safety of some of our team. And from that point on, we realized that we needed to think as a professional organization, both for our own security, but also from a client perspective, about these kind of situations that seem to come from nowhere and yet cause complete chaos. The Eyjafjallajökull, which is the Icelandic volcano that then interrupted global travel for a short period of, say, 2.5 months, back in 2010.
Well, why is it then that seemingly so many smaller organizations have already responded, have already pivoted, and pivot seems to be the word after unprecedented, pivot seems to be the most popular word out there at the moment.
Yeah.
Why is it that we're not seeing much of a reaction from enterprise, and yet we are seeing some profound pivots from small and medium-sized organizations?
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. I think it goes back to this notion of the incremental. And I think often it's a question of gearing, in that larger organizations just aren't fitted out to respond so quickly. It's that idea, the analogy that they're the tankers, that they take so much longer to turn around. They can't pivot that quickly because as their size, their bureaucracy, the politics, the aversion to risk are all factors that mean that they tend to go slow and steady. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because in the way that if you're a pub, you've suddenly got to think about what you're going to do with all those eggs that you've ordered. Or if you're the supplier to McDonald's and suddenly they're not buying your eggs, how are you going to put those eggs into the food distribution mechanism and rethink that kind of element of what you deliver? You might suddenly turn into the delivery system or the hub point for collection or whatever it might be. But if you are a global business and a global brand, you've got the opportunity and the resources to actually be having one team coping with the logistical problem that is now, and another team who are really, really focused on post-COVID-19 in terms of what's my consumer landscape going to look like in 6 months to 12 months time. And part of that might be that, well, we maybe don't actually need to alter very much as an organization, because we still believe that what we do is sound, that what we deliver is required, and that our client is still going to need this from us in 6 months' time. So we just have to hold our course. We have to continue doing what we do. We just need to stay solvent. We need to keep our people employed. We need to keep them focused, and that's what we need to do. But it could be also that we realize that this is just one factor, a catalyst even for other changes that are happening around us, and that COVID-19, or that idea of that instant impact element, is going to radically change the way our consumer thinks and feels and behaves and believes. So we now need to get ready to think about what it is they're going to want from us in 6 months' time. And this, of course, is what we saw with the GFC, which is that businesses and brands needed to come out of that period, not just of commercial meltdown, economic meltdown caused obviously by what happened in the US with subprime mortgages and the impact, the butterfly effect, the ripple effect that that had across our global economies. But that wasn't just about an economic response. There was also an underlying consumer rethink, or a reset to some extent, about their engagement with consumption, with the shopping process. It was about the growth of online. And it was about the way they were starting to rethink certain elements of their lives and what they wanted. And exactly the same is happening here again, 10 years on.
Well, Chris Sanderson, thank you very much for joining us. All the best with your deliberations and with your clients and with your team. As a global organization, let's hope that your influence continues into the future, and stay safe and stay isolated out there. It actually looks wonderful.
Well, we'll do our best. Take care, mate.
Cheers. And we thank Chris again for that excellent chat. What we've also seen is an increasing amount of backlash against the Chinese government's approach to the Wuhan flu, and the way in which they hid and distorted some of the data coming out, which directly led to a lot of the issues we've seen around the world today. And what this is now leading to are a number of questions and conversations around China's culpability, not just in the context of the Wuhan flu, but as the Washington Post has put it, it's time to practice social and economic distancing from China, and raising the context not only of coronavirus, but obviously also the context of are we relying too much on China, especially given they do have a somewhat malevolent communist regime in charge. And given that there is what we might call large elements of sovereign risk there, what does that then mean for the rest of the world? Speaking of which, in response to that, I would suggest the Australian government has made some, very radical changes to the foreign investment framework. The Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, has announced that the Foreign Investment Review Board will be reviewing every single dollar of foreign investment into Australia, and that any investment in any Australian company will come under the Foreign Investment Review Board, something that has only generally happened in the past, given huge investment or in sensitive industries. Quite a remarkable shift. Now, Josh Frydenberg has come out and said this isn't about China directly, but anyway, I'll let you be the judge of that. What we're also read an interesting article here to kind of bring up the tone a little bit more. Coronavirus is killing the box office. Hollywood may never be the same. Interestingly, the Trolls World Tour is going to be released more or less direct to streaming services rather than via the cinema, and that will be happening shortly. Interestingly enough, what we've seen just in Australia is that Foxtel, the pay TV service, has more or less just given everything away for free, or at least as part of your existing package, based on the fact that there's no sport. So we're clearly seeing that sport is a key driver of subscription television. Now, one of our segments here is the what's government done for me lately? The Australian government has launched a JobKeeper payment package, of which we won't go into too many details, except to say that there is basically a $1,500 per fortnight subsidy for various employees, casuals, and part-timers that are employed by Australian businesses. One of the bigger handouts that we're seeing at the moment is Virgin seek a $1.4 billion government bailout. And what we have heard for a long period is that Virgin are an organisation in a lot of trouble. The government announced a $750 million bailout for airlines only about 2 weeks ago, but I think Virgin are in serious strife and are looking for a hell of a lot more than that. And let's see what happens, because it would be disastrous if we had a monopoly in Australia's air travel. The City of Melbourne have come up with a range of COVID-19 small business grants available from the City of Melbourne website. Have a look at those. And then another area where there's a fair bit of conjecture over government interference is what is deemed an essential service in a lockdown. Interestingly enough, some jurisdictions, such as Pennsylvania or in India, alcohol retail has been shuttered, whereas in other parts of the world, such as France, they've spared their wine merchants. And in the Netherlands and in California, cannabis dispensaries are allowed to reopen. And we'll just show you an article shortly of where there are queues of people hoarding cannabis in the Netherlands. Again, a very interesting article in The Economist that is currently free. Celebrity COVID of the day, of course, over the last few days. Good old Boris Johnson. Best wishes and best of luck to Boris Johnson. May he be cured of this, and may he get through it with a minimum of issues. Again, pretty awful that we've seen such a what we might regard as world leader, but also an important figure in the reconstruction and the management of any economy, the Prime Minister, being affected by COVID. In other words, it affects everyone. So 70-year-olds, don't think you're immune. Interestingly, just in the last couple of hours, Apple have released an Apple COVID-19 app worth downloading. It's available free on the Apple App Store. And then what we've also got is a really interesting article in The Economist 1843 magazine, Tabletop Generals, board games are back, thanks to the lessons their designers have learnt from computer games. And there's a list here of games, and to be honest, I didn't really know any of them. Carcassonne, Dominion, Karuba, Puerto Rico, and Pandemic Legacy. Some interesting board games that might be worth playing. Just as a thought, Saturday night, a whole group of friends and I played Cards Against Humanity over Zoom. It's the perfect game to play over Zoom. It works particularly well. We had a couple of bottles of wine, got very silly and had a great laugh. So either you can actually go to the Cards Against Humanity website and download Cards Against Humanity for free, or you can go, if you can, get to a shop that sells them that's still open and buy it. It is a ripping game to play. And we've also seen some great pivots. They come in thick and fast. In Australia, we've seen the manufacturer of Bathurst-winning Commodores and racing cars offer to make ventilators amid the COVID-19 outbreak. We've also seen initiatives where all of the UK-based Formula One teams have joined in an initiative called Project Pit Lane, where they're using all of their engineering smarts to make ventilators. So good on them. That's a brilliant effort. And what we've done at Penso, big announcement, we have launched Covets.com. Here it is, Covets, C-O-V-O-T-S. We've come up with our own portmanteau there, which is COVOTS.com. Penso's collecting case studies. COVOTS, of course, is COVID pivots, of course, the portmanteau. Collecting case studies of businesses that have pivoted during the COVID-19 crisis. Get inspired by these COVID-19 pivots, as we call them, Covets, and you can submit a Covet right there. So get on COVOTS.com and submit your Covets. We've listed as many industries as we could get a handle on, and if you click through here, you'll see some examples of certain possible Covets, and some examples. Love Athletica have taken their popular Pilates classes online and using them to build a subscription service using their Reformer Pilates machine. So good on you there at Love Athletica, all the way through to a range of other industries there. Get onto COVOTS.com, Covets.com, and if you've seen any inspiring pivots, what we'd really like to do is ensure that this recovery is not only a substantial health recovery, but we'd also like to see businesses recover, because a lot of businesses are doing it very hard and a lot of people are doing it very hard. So submit your ideas to covits.com. Submit examples of great pivots you've seen anywhere in the world to covits.com. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us here on Constantine Quarantine. Stay safe, stay hygienic, stay at home, and most of all, stay well. See you soon.